Every crime hides a story. Every story hides a truth. Welcome to The Watcher, where we uncover the mysteries others look away from. Rachel couldn't shake the image of Alice Peterson in that dilapidated cabin, her hollow eyes staring back at her like a specter from the past. The woman who had once been the epitome of charm and grace had, over the years, transformed into a desperate and broken figure. But even now, after everything she had done, Alice remained cold, detached. There was no remorse in her confession, only an eerie, almost clinical explanation of her actions. Rachel had spent hours with Alice, trying to understand the madness that had driven her to kill the Miller family. There was no sense of redemption in Alice's words, no apology. In fact, Alice seemed to take pride in what she had done. She spoke of her feelings for George with a twisted affection, almost as if she were a jilted lover seeking revenge. The truth, as painful as it was finally clear. Alice hadn't just taken the lives of 4 people out of jealousy. She had executed a cold, calculated plan to remove everyone she perceived as an obstacle to her own happiness. Alice's confession, chilling in its simplicity, provided the final pieces to a puzzle that had haunted Cedar Hollow for nearly 2 decades. The murder wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of rage, but the culmination of months, perhaps years, of obsession. When Rachel asked Alice how she had carried out the murders, she simply shrugged. It wasn't hard. I was always close by. George had his weaknesses and I knew how to use them. The children weren't a problem either. They were just in the way. Alice's voice had no tremor. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't crying. She was cold, calculated, speaking as though she were recounting an ordinary event. It was as if the lives of the Millers and their deaths meant nothing to her. The night I took them, Alice continued, I waited until George was gone. I knew he'd be out late meeting friends, so I slipped inside. The children were already asleep. I waited for Rebecca in the kitchen. When she walked in, I had the knife ready. She didn't even scream. Rachel closed her eyes as Alice detailed the brutality of the night, how she had methodically silenced the family one by one before she disposed of their bodies. She had planned it all, down to the smallest detail, but Rachel knew there was more lurking beneath Alice's calm exterior. Alice's obsession with George Miller had led her to a horrifying place. But Rachel began to see a deeper thread of desperation in Alice's actions. It wasn't just about George. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about Alice's need for control, her desire to rewrite her own story, to take back the power she felt she had lost. As Rachel pieced the final fragments of Alice's confession together, she felt a pang of sorrow. For all the clarity she had found, the knowledge didn't bring her peace. It didn't bring closure to the lives that had been lost. The Miller family would never come back. No justice could undo what had been done. The days following Alice's arrest were a blur. Cedar Hollow was shaken to its core, unable to grasp the enormity of the truth. Alice had been a part of their town for so long, and yet, they had never suspected the darkness that resided within her. The town had trusted her, perhaps even cared for her. But they had no idea that this seemingly fragile woman had been capable of such horror. Rachel had solved the case. She had found the missing pieces, uncovered the killer's identity, and brought Alice to justice. But no one could have prepared her for the emptiness she felt. Walking through the town after Alice's confession felt surreal. Cedar Hollow, the town she had known her whole life, now seemed alien to her. Everything had changed, and not for the better. The air that had once smelled of pine now seemed thick with grief and betrayal. Rachel stood in the town square one evening, staring at the empty house where the Millers had once lived. The lights in the windows had been extinguished years ago, and the house had become just another reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. For the first time in her career, Rachel understood the full cost of solving a case. She had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a personal cost. The faces of Mia, Lucas, Rebecca, and George haunted her every step. She had delivered the answers they had been waiting for, but what good was the truth if it couldn't bring them back? Alice Peterson's trial was a media circus. It seemed that every station from around the country descended on Cedar Hollow to cover the case. The small-town courthouse was packed, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and sorrow. For the victims' families, this was a chance to finally see justice, but the trial also served as a grim reminder of the brutal acts Alice had committed. As Alice sat in the defendant's chair, staring vacantly ahead, Rachel watched from the back of the courtroom. Alice was a picture of calm. She had no emotions left to give. She had confessed to everything in detail, almost as if she were narrating a boring story. There was no remorse. There were no tears. Only a woman who had been consumed by obsession and was now reaping the consequences of her actions. The trial lasted for weeks, but the verdict was never in doubt. Alice Peterson was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Rachel couldn't bring herself to join in. Justice had been served, but the truth had come too late. The impact of the Miller family's murder rippled throughout Cedar Hollow for years to come. The once peaceful town was now scarred by the brutal acts of one of its own. People who had known Alice for years struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster she had become. Rachel, too, had to face the reality of her own involvement in the case. She had solved it. She had found the answers. But the truth wasn't as satisfying as she had imagined. The Miller family was gone. And though justice had been done, the hole they left behind could never be filled. Cedar Hollow slowly began to heal, but it would never be the same. The scars of the past remained, etched into the minds of everyone who had been touched by the Miller family's tragic end. Rachel walked away from the case with a heavier heart than she had ever known. She had brought the truth to light, but she realized that some mysteries, no matter how well they were solved, would never allow you to move on. Rachel sat on her porch one evening, gazing out over the town she had spent her entire life in. The cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine, but it no longer felt comforting. Cedar Hollow would never feel the same again. The disappearance of the Miller family had shattered more than just their lives. It had shattered the innocence of the town itself. And as Rachel reflected on everything she had learned, everything she had uncovered, she couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes the truth wasn't enough. Sometimes it left you with nothing but sorrow. But even then, it was all she had. In the end, the Miller family story was a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. Alice Peterson's obsession, her thirst for control, and her brutal need for revenge had claimed 4 lives, and it had changed the course of a town forever. For Rachel Green, the journey had been long and painful, but in solving the case, she had come to understand a harsh truth about justice. Some answers bring peace, but others only open wounds that can never heal. Subscribe for more.